Nice. Senator Peterson is here with us today. He's the newest member and would like to welcome you to Post-Audit Committee. We're happy to have you. I've never had the opportunity to work with you, but I'm looking forward to it because I've heard nothing but good things about you, sir. So looking forward to getting to know you better. All right, so we are live streamed starting at 12:30, which was a few minutes ago. Make sure to turn on and use your mic so people online can listen. And make sure you sign your travel vouchers by the end of the day. First item on the agenda is to elect a committee vice chair. Our vice chair is no longer with us. And I'm going to recognize Chris to explain how this works.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. By committee rule, this committee elects its own leadership. This is an odd numbered year, so that means that the chair is from the House side and the vice chair is from the Senate side. By committee rule, the chair and vice chair must be from different houses. The third member of the executive committee is Senator Ware, and by committee rule, no more than 2 of the 3 members of the executive committee can be from the same party. So at this point, Mr. Chair, you would solicit nominations for a vice chair, again, from the Senate.
Okay, we'll open up for nominations. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would nominate Senator Karen Tyson.
Senator Tyson, you good with that? Okay. Are there any other nominations? All right, seeing none. Do we need to vote on that or just, okay, all in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All against say no. Do we need a second on that? Senator Thompson seconds it. Motion passes. Congratulations. Okay, so now we're going to get into the performance audits and evaluation section. You can move over here now if you'd like. Sure. The last guy didn't work out too well, so. We'll start with election security. Andy from LPA is going to go ahead and present the audit. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So this is part 2. Part 1 we released in February, and that covered questions 3 through 5 of the original proposal. This is going to cover questions 1 and 2, which for reporting purposes we have combined into a single question, which you can see on page 2 in the introductory section. And that question is, do county election offices have adequate policies and procedures to ensure the accuracy and security of voting machines, ballots, storage units, and devices used to tabulate votes during elections? Now, in order to evaluate this, we couldn't look at all 105 Kansas counties. That would simply be too much, so we looked at a selection of 15, and based on those 15, you will see on page 4 that the 15 counties we reviewed had some security practices that were indeed adequate, others that were inadequate, but none had adequate written policies. So I will get to that sort of towards the end. A lot of what I'm going to cover and a lot of the report content talks about practices because none of these counties had policies. So there wasn't a lot to review, not a lot to conclude on, and I will return to that at the end. So, but before we get into the findings, there is some background information on pages 4 and 5. Some of this is repeated from part 1. So figure 1, for instance, was also in part 1. This is a reminder about how complex elections actually are. There's a lot of things that are happening both before and after election day. In fact, there's more that's happening before and after. So like what a typical voter sees at the polling place is a tiny sliver of what's really happening. Because it's so complex, there's a lot of security controls that need to be in place to ensure that nothing goes wrong. And the person who's responsible for that, you can see at the county level on page 5, is the county election officer. So In most counties, this is the county clerk. In the 4 largest, this is the appointed election commissioner. And this person is responsible for determining what the election security controls are going to be in their county, along with everything else that's happening. And in order for those to be carried out in practice, they rely on the people at the bottom of page 5, county election workers. These are volunteers, and they are doing all the frontline election duties that really make an election possible. And in order to do that securely, they need to be following the controls that their county election officer has put in place. Okay. If we flip to page 6 at the top, you'll see that election processes vary significantly from county to county. So the election officer has discretion over how they're going to run their elections. And a lot of the difference comes from the number of voters. So we have a couple of examples at the top of page 6. A large county in this example has 2,000 pieces of machinery, 150 polling places, a standalone purpose-built office and secure storage facility. On the other hand, we have a smaller county. They have 2 staff, they have 5 machines, they have 1 polling place, they have a small open plan office in the historic county courthouse, and a lockable closet in the basement. And so the processes that are needed to run the bigger county's election are simply much more complicated and require many more security controls than the smaller county. And that sort of large county, small county dichotomy we'll return to later on when we get into the meat of the findings. Now, if you look on the bottom of page 6, top of page 7, you will see that modern elections really rely heavily on electronic equipment. So there's 4 types I want to point out here, and this is all outlined on page 6. So when a voter goes to a voting place, they can hand fill out a paper ballot, but if they don't, then they use a voting machine. It's a ballot marking device. That's the screen they walk up to and they make their selections. That prints out a completed ballot for them, and then they take that and they run it through the next type of machine I want to point out, which is the tabulation machine. This is an optical scanner that is reading, interpreting what has been marked on the ballot. And we talked about this on part 1 in the context of ballot images and cast vote records for the counties that use those. That's where these would be created. Within that machine is election results storage media. This is basically a USB stick. And so as people are running their ballots through the machine, the USB stick is tracking the tabulation. And at the end of the night, the county election officer or county election worker will remove that USB stick and hand carry it back to the election office and insert it into the final type of electronic equipment that I'm going to cover, which is the election management computer. So each tabulator in each polling place has results on a USB stick. They plug them in, and then this computer aggregates the countywide results and determines who the winner is. There's one county, Sheridan County, that has hand-completed, hand-counted paper ballots. They don't rely on these machines. We included them in our sample because they're an outlier, but otherwise, every other county is very heavily reliant on electronic equipment. Okay, page 7, we talk a little bit about the best practices that we reviewed. So we pulled 50 best practices from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the EAC. This is the federal agency that, as an example of what they do in the election space, they create those guidelines that many people have heard about for certifying election equipment. So they're a very knowledgeable source. We found they have a lot of best practices. We pulled 50 that we thought would be important to most counties' security. And as you can see at the bottom of page 7 and then most of page 8, they fell into 5, those 50 fell into 5 sort of overarching categories. So the first one is at the bottom of page 7. This is what we call overall process security. This is super basic stuff that's required to have a secure election. So for instance, buying certified equipment, inventorying that equipment, kind of tracking what happens to it. Top of page 8, election management computer security. This is that computer that's aggregating the results. So we had several best practices related to that. This is things like keeping that computer physically secure, logging activity, adding complex passwords, and keeping it disconnected from the internet. Third, we have ballot security. The long and short of this is tracking comprehensively ballot activity. So when paper ballots are sent out from the election office to polling places, tracking what happens to every single one of them, accounting for them, and ensuring that when they come back, they have the correct number and the ones that should be voted are voted the ones that should be unused or unused, et cetera. Fourth, we have voting and tabulation machine security. So part of this is keeping these machines physically secure, like in the warehouse in between elections, for instance. A lot of it is actually related to testing them. So acceptance testing when they first arrive from the manufacturer, logic and accuracy testing right before an election to make sure they're still working as they should, things like that. Finally, transfer and movement security. So obviously, in order to have an election, ballots, electronic equipment, all this stuff has to be moved from secure storage from the election office to polling places. And so we reviewed several controls related to ensuring those things arrive untampered with and there aren't any problems that come from that. At the bottom of page 8, top of page 9, you'll see we also looked at state law. We found 5 additional things in state law that we wanted to review. So that brings our total to 55. And for a complete list of all 55, you can look at Appendix B. I'm not going to talk about them individually. Okay, so as I mentioned, we pulled a selection of counties to assess whether Kansas counties have the policies and practices that they should, that align with these 55 best practices and state laws. We list the 13 here that we could review in their entirety. If you flip to page 10, you'll see that there were 2 additional, this brings our total to 15, that we couldn't review in their entirety. So for all 15, we could assess whether they have written policies that reflect the best practices and state laws that we were looking at. 2 counties, though, they sealed up their 2022 election documentation, which was the other thing that we were reviewing, to see whether counties were carrying out these practices during a live election. They sealed these things in ballot containers. So state law does not allow us to access what's in ballot containers. They have to remain sealed once they're sealed. So we simply could not get enough documentation from the 2 counties on page 10, Chase and Ford, in order to draw conclusions. They will return when I talk about policies at the end, but the rest of this, when I'm talking about practices, we're talking about the other 13 that we reviewed. Bottom of page 10, top of page 11, there's some caveats that are important that I want to point out. So the first one is, I just mentioned documentation. All of our conclusions about counties' practices during 2022 are based on 2 things: documentation, which we could independently verify, and our own observations. So we went to all these counties, we inspected their offices, their storage facilities, in most cases, their election management computers. And so some of this stuff we could observe ourselves with our own eyes. Other things, we had to rely on documentation from 2022. There were cases where county election officers told us they did the things that we were reviewing for, but they didn't have documentation that would show that, so we couldn't give them credit, so to speak. So it's possible that there are cases where counties are doing some of this stuff, they just didn't write it down, so we couldn't verify it on our own. The other thing I want to make very clear is that we did not evaluate whether the 2022 elections were tabulated the right way, accurately reflected the will of the voters, anything like that. We're simply reviewing whether these counties had controls in place that would support election security, that would ideally lead to those types of outcomes. We didn't review whether that stuff happened. Finally, I want to say that we did not review 2020. So by the time we started this, county's 2020 documentation was either sealed or in most cases it was destroyed in alignment with state and federal law. Okay, so pages 11 through 19 have the results. And they're broken down by those 5 categories that I mentioned before. So we have examples of what's going on in the counties that we reviewed, but the figures 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, are all pretty good high-level summaries of what we found. So the way that we organize these figures is into intermediate level categories. So we have 55 best practices and state laws. We rolled them up into slightly higher level intermediate categories to make them sort of easier to digest. And that's what we see in the figures. The figures also have, there's 4 possible colors, shades of blue. The 2 darker shades are more of the best practices that we reviewed being in place. So the darkest shade would indicate that some or all, most or all of the best practices and state laws are in place. And as you can see, for example, on overall process security, this is figure 2. Generally, the counties that we reviewed had adequate processes. Here, there's a lot of dark blue, which indicates that they had adequate processes in place here, or practices, excuse me. The next category that I want to talk about is election management computer security. You'll see, again, lots of dark blue. Overall, things are pretty strong. There was a couple of counties that you can see had slightly weaker practices in this area. We talk more about them on page 14. Generally speaking, these weaknesses come from like infrastructure limitations. So these counties are smaller or medium-sized. They don't have like standalone purpose-built office facilities for their election management computers. The counties that had stronger performance, like Johnson would be a great example of this, they have their own office that is specifically devoted to the election management computer. Some of the smaller counties, they're working within the limitations of their historic county courthouse or wherever else they find themselves. And so they put their computers into dual-use spaces like conference rooms and things like that, and that creates some limitations in terms of the controls that they can have in place. Page 15, figure 4, this is ballot security, so you're going to see slightly lighter shades of blue from now on. So we're finding here that the practices are becoming a little bit weaker. But in general, counties did pretty well in this area. The problems that we found were really related to documenting like a comprehensive accounting of what's happening to all the ballots that are being sent out from election offices to polling places. So and they kind of fall into a couple of different categories. So one of them would be counties that have documentation that is missing critical elements like how many voters use voting machines, because without knowing how many voters used voting machines, those ballot marking devices, you can't know how many voters should have used paper ballots, so you can't comprehensively account for what happened. The other thing we saw in some counties was that they had forms that were well designed, they had all of the elements in place that they needed to, but they were either missing, they weren't filled out adequately, they had numbers that didn't add up correctly, they had blanks, things like that. And so in those instances, we think that's probably mostly a training issue. So the form is set up well, but election workers are not using it as they should. Let's go to page 16. This is our fourth area, which is voting and tabulation machine security. So you can see in the figure that generally speaking, counties are keeping voting and tabulation machines physically secure. Most of the issues that we found in this area were related to some of those tests that I mentioned before. So specifically, acceptance testing, when they first receive the machines from the manufacturer, running a mock election, doing things like that to make sure that they're working as expected. Logic and accuracy testing, which is again running a mock election right before they deploy these machines to make sure that they're working correctly. And then after the fact, for the tabulators specifically, there's a state law that requires a post-election test to make sure that they're still working after the election as expected. There were cases where counties said they did these things, but they didn't have documentation showing that. And there were other cases where, for example, the logic and accuracy testing, the best practices call for that to be done by 2 people to make sure it's impartial. Many counties, they would document it, but they only had 1 person doing it, so we had to ding them for that. Bottom of page 17 and then on to page 18. This is the last category. This is transfer and movement security. So you'll see it's kind of a mixed bag here. So there are some areas where counties are doing better. There are some counties that are doing better in general than others. Some of the issues here were just, again, documenting what is happening when these machines and ballots are being moved from the election office to the polling place and back. So not all of them are comprehensively recording who is doing this, when they're doing it, recording seal numbers that are being applied to the machines, ensuring that the machines are still sealed with the same seal, with the same number when it arrives, things like that. Probably the most pervasive problem that we found in this area, though, was related to transporting completed ballots back to the election office at the end of the night. So state law requires that 2 people from different parties do this. I think my recollection is there was 1 polling place of all of the ones that we reviewed that actually did that. So in all the other instances, it was 1 person or it was 2 people from the same party. Okay, page 19. Our general takeaway from this is that the larger counties, as I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, they have greater needs, they have greater resources in terms of staff and time and infrastructure, and so they have stronger performance against these practices, which is sort of intuitive. They have very complicated processes. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of machines and polling places. So to make sure that nothing goes wrong, they need stronger stronger practices, and they need to document those practices more robustly than the smaller counties. Flipping to page 20, toward the bottom, I'm going to return very briefly to policies. So as I mentioned before, none of the counties we reviewed had adequate written policies. What we kind of expected going into this is that counties would have comprehensive, unified, regularly updated policy and procedure manuals that captured what the county election officer expected in terms of security controls that should be in place. And we found that none of the counties we reviewed had that. Finally, page 21, you'll see that we think a lot of this is probably coming from the Secretary of State's office not playing a proactive enough role in assisting counties in terms of providing them with things like standardized form templates and training for county election officers, maybe baseline security guidelines that they can apply, things like that. We think the Secretary of State should more proactively do some of those things. And our recommendations, starting on page 23, are along those lines, which they agreed to. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention is that county election workers are the ones who are doing this. And so it's really incumbent upon the county election officers to train them, impress upon them the importance of these controls, and then hold them accountable for carrying them out. And we think that's probably not happening to the extent that it could be, and that's part of the problem. So we have several appendices that elucidate some of these things in greater detail, but otherwise I am happy to stand for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm sure we all had plenty of time to review this before this meeting, and so I'm sure there's plenty of questions. I have several, but I'll hold mine till the end to see if anybody else asks it. Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. Does any of this account for the turnover? I'm thinking especially the leadership. In my county, we would have had a brand new county commissioner, election commissioner, who has now been replaced. Does, the relative greenness, so to speak, get factored into this in any way?
So we are aware that there's been a lot of turnover in this area in terms of both county election officers and county election workers. We heard from the county clerks and election commissioners who we talked to that they're having trouble getting enough election worker volunteers. In many cases, they can't get enough of one party or the other, and that leads to some of the problems that we found in terms of having bipartisan teams doing things. So that would increase the need for training. So if you have a bunch of new election workers, they need adequate training to know why this stuff is important and then how to do it. County election officers, to the extent that they're having a lot of turnover too, it's similar. So if they don't have a lot of experience in this area, then they would probably have less familiarity with the types of practices that they should have in place, the types of controls they should have in place. And in our estimation, that increases the importance of the Secretary of State's office's role in this. They have the adequate expertise and experience that they would need to really provide county election officers with the tools that they need, the information that they need to do these things more robustly. So I think that's definitely part of the story here.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. Number one, on the Chase and Ford County, they sealed their documentation in with the election results. Did they know that this audit was coming and were aware that you wanted to look at that documentation?
The short answer is yes. So toward the beginning of our work, we gave them a sense of the types of best practices that we would be reviewing against and asked them to hold out of those containers the types of documentation that they would need to show us whether they were doing those things in 2022. The other thing I'll say is that practice of indiscriminately sealing election-related materials into ballot containers, which really isn't their purpose, is not uncommon. So although there was only 2 of this group of 15 that did that, the Secretary of State's office mentioned to us that happens regularly. And so we don't think that aligns with CORA. And one of our recommendations for the Secretary of State's office is to impress upon county election officials that it's important to keep those things out of those containers.
I was going to say, because if you seal it up, you can't get back in it to verify certain documentation. And I'm assuming Sheridan scored lower just because they don't use the machines on a lot of these things.
There were some cases in which we marked the best practices as NA for them because, for instance, they don't have an election management computer, so we couldn't evaluate their controls for an election management computer. There were other things where they did score lower than others, probably because their focus is elsewhere, and so they didn't necessarily have some of those controls in place that they could for things like a ballot marking device, which federal law requires them to have, and they do deploy, but their focus is on those hand-completed paper ballots.
Just one more, Mr. Chair. And with regard to the security of returning the machines after the election, would you say that that seems like a potentially vulnerable point for, yeah, I realize delivering, but those machines are secured and locked away until the next election and they pulled out. But after an election, if those security measures are not up to snuff, that could be a potential place where something could happen. Is that correct?
Theoretically, that's true, although so they would be transported back from the polling place to the election office, put into storage. The tabulators should be tested after they return back to the election office. That's a control to see whether they're continuing to work as expected. When they're locked away at the in the county's facility, once they come back out for the next election, they should be tested again. And so some of these controls would be repeated. And if there was a compromise that would have happened en route from the polling place back to the election office, theoretically, the logic and accuracy test that would happen before the next election would catch something like that.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Sure, and I'd like to piggyback on that first part on Chase and Ford County sealing documents that they otherwise shouldn't have, especially when it's alarming to me if they knew what you were looking for and then they sealed those documents anyway. Is there any way at all we can get a look at those documents? Can we sue them under the Open Records Act to get them unsealed, or can the Attorney General do anything in order to release those documents to the public like they should be?
So my understanding is the only thing that can impel a county to unseal one of those containers is a court order.
So that there is a way?
Yes.
Okay. And it's especially alarming that after sealing those documents, Ford County also wouldn't let you look at their management computer. Did they give you, I mean, they didn't seal that up, obviously, so what reason did they give you for that?
So we were in the room with the computer, and the county clerk told us that she disagreed that we had the authority to access that computer and inspect it in the way that we did in the other counties.
And we just left it at that?
We pressed a little bit, but I mean, ultimately, if she wouldn't allow us to access it, then we couldn't force her to do that.
Okay, that's interesting. Any other questions? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is following up on Senator Thompson's question. And going to the tabulation machine accuracy portion of it, we talked about the transfer of the machines, but I want to talk a little bit more about the actual ballots. One of the things we heard in your area, your neck of the woods, were reports of individuals actually filing a complaint with authorities relating to their actual physical ballot not matching what they had keyed in or what they believed they keyed in. So when you look at this, tabulation machine accuracy is double checked after the elections on page 16. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the larger counties don't check it. And when I think about this question, I'm actually wondering, do these 150 locations per county or 50 locations per county, do they do a physical printout for all the machines? These are how many individuals voted for person A, B, C, or do they actually have a USB stick that they go and take it out of the machine and take it back to their county and tabulate it that way? What's the typical method?
So it's sort of both. So the way that the official results are tabulated is the USB stick, the election results storage media, is in the tabulator. They pull it out, they physically walk it back to the election office. They plug that into the election management computer, and then that is part of the aggregated countywide results. The tabulators also print off results, what are called results tapes, and that shows so first they print off a zero tape at the beginning, and that shows that all of the races are zero, officially zero at the beginning of the day. Then at the end, they print off a results tape, and that shows the results of all of the ballots that have been fed through that tabulator. And theoretically, you could use that, review what should have come out of that tabulator to what is being shown at the election results or the election management computer and tie those. So they have a check in that sense.
Okay, so if that is possibly one of the checks for this tabulation machine accuracy is double checked after elections, we're seeing that the majority of our large counties don't do anything like that.
Okay, so the thing that I think you're talking about, this is the
More the transfer
the
of the
bottom line. So that is specifically a check that is new. So this is a 2022 new thing in state law, and a lot of counties that we reviewed don't have adequate processes set up yet for it. But this is slightly different. So all of the tabulators that were deployed for the election, when they come back, they should be subject to a public post-election test where they run a mock election that has certain requirements. And what we found is that counties are not doing that either with all of their tabulators, which in the big counties is really most of the problem because they have so many of them, or they're not following this particular requirements that are outlined for that test. So like, and these are in Appendix B.
It's 27.
Thanks. So this would be like, they would not include one or more ballots for each office that have more votes than allowed by law to test the machine's ability to reject overvotes. Like they may have overvotes for some races, but not all of them, and so then they fail. So in some cases, they're not doing it on all the machines. In other cases, they're not following all the particulars of what's required in the law. But that's a slightly different test than like the results tapes and things like that.
Thank you.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've got some recommendations here. Does the Secretary of State's office have the authority to like issue rules and regs possibly to address most of these, or is there some legislative changes that need to be made?
In terms of the Secretary of State's office's authority, I will defer that question to them. In terms of making legislative changes, obviously that's a policy consideration, and that would be for you all to decide. And we don't have any recommendations along those lines for legislative consideration.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few questions. First off, I would like to thank Sheridan County and all of her team for hand counting the ballots. That is impressive, and I wish more counties were doing that. Mr. Chairman, I have a few questions on the audit. One of the items that you mentioned was on page 12. You said that if they did at least half of your parameters, that's a pretty low bar to give them a high mark. Could you please address that? I mean, that's saying that they're doing 50% of what you looked for. That leaves a lot of holes.
So the question was whether they had adequate policies and practices. So we had to come up with some definition of adequacy, which is not in state law. So these practices, we determined that if they were following half of them, in other words, in any given area, if they had at least half of the best practices in place, we thought that was adequate. And the reason for that is because most of these things, there's only 8 of them were of the best practices from the EAC are fully reflected in state law. 3 of them are partially reflected, and then 5 of them that we reviewed are actually from state law originally. So most of the stuff is not in state law, it's not in administrative regulations. Before we came along, no one formally told them that they had to be doing these things. And so we thought that if they were doing them, at least halfway, so to speak, that was adequate.
Okay, thank you. We have some work to do. Mr. Chairman, may I continue? Thank you. I would ask, the next question is, did you test the control mechanisms that were in place for these counties that were testing their equipment? And the reason I ask that, I'm going to give you a specific example. I was speaking to a county during 2022 election,
And they asked me how they would not have caught that their machine had inverted the election results. So I asked them about their test scenarios, and they were testing the same number of ballots. So they would never catch an inaccuracy or a miscalibration, miscomputing, whatever you want to call it. So did you check their testing scenarios?
So this is the logic and accuracy testing, if I'm understanding, that happens before the machines are deployed. So they run a mock election, and in order to catch whether the votes are being tabulated the right way, it has to be a ratio other than 1-to-1. Because if it's 1-to-1 and they're all being flipped, you would never know. So we reviewed all of the logic and accuracy testing scripts and printouts and things like that, and we didn't see any that were a 1-to-1 ratio. They all used ratios other than that.
So I just got lucky on the county that I talked to. They were using a 1-to-1. She's changed it since then. Their machine actually inverted an election result, and she couldn't figure out why the test wasn't caught. And it happened in other counties too. So I don't think our testing is adequate enough in order to ensure that we do not have that situation going on. The only time we look at the results to see if they've been flipped is if it's an egregious, like this gentleman lived out of state and won the election. So I would hope that we would take a closer look at that. But you guys did look at those scripts.
We did, and the other thing I'll say is we looked at 15, and we can't speak to what's happening in the other 90 counties, which is a caveat to all of this.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I have concern. I will reiterate the senator and the chairman's comments on Ford County, especially putting those documents in knowing full well that you wanted access to them. I know that we've had issues in Ford County before. We can look to their single location polling place in Dodge City. Many of us have heartburn over that on both parties. So I'm hoping that we do try to get access to those, Mr. Chairman, and follow through. I had one other comment. I won't say the county, but it is one of the counties that you tested. I do know in the 2022 election that you checked, were you testing primary and/or general elections?
Yes, primary and/or general. We reviewed one or the other rather than both.
So we had a gentleman that had 2 ballots handed to him in one of the counties that you tested. How would they ever catch that if, I mean, I don't see any checks or balances for that type of error and for our auditing.
So this was a person who was physically present at a polling place and was handed 2 ballots. That might be a good question for Brian Caskey. I would say that the number of check-ins for the poll at the poll pad should match the number of voted ballots, and so that would catch whether there's an extra.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the audit.
Yeah, and it's pointed out several times, we need to work on ballot tracking for sure. So that's something we might want to look at this year. Any other, Senator Thompson, you have more? Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple. And again, thank you for this audit. I really, it allows us a deeper dive or shows us where we need to look, I think. I think one important statement that was made at the bottom of page 6, and you kind of gloss over, is that every process in the election is heavily reliant on electronic equipment. So the security of that equipment, to me, seems to be paramount. What does the EAC, and I know you looked at them as some of the best practices, do they have any practices that they recommended that you didn't look at with regard to the security of the machines, whether or not there might be something in the BIOS or the firmware that could run a concealed type of software that that turns on, turns off, change? We've got people who are concerned about that who've contacted us, and so are there best practices that we're not using that we should be using or should be considering with regard to that?
The EAC had a lot of best practices, more than we could review. It's entirely possible, I don't have a comprehensive list of them in my mind. It's entirely possible that there are some that would directly address the type of thing that you're talking about. The other 2 things I'll mention are that actually a lot of the practices we did review, although they don't directly talk about those types of concerns would help prevent things like that from happening. So keeping them disconnected from the internet, logging activity, having complex password requirements, things like that. A lot of the same stuff that like our IT security audit team looks at would help to prevent those types of compromises. The other thing is the EAC releases what are called VVSGs, or Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. They just released a few years ago an updated version 2.0, and we talk about this more in Appendix C. But some of those tests that are required to be done by independent labs would ensure that, I don't have a comprehensive understanding of the VVSGs. I guess my speculation, and maybe Secretary of State's office could speak to this too, is that those tests would ensure that there are controls in place to prevent those types of compromises.
Yeah, I've heard we're only using like VVSG 1.0 instead of 2.0 in a lot of cases from what I've understood. And I don't have a deep understanding of that, but that's all the question I have. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. I appreciate the audit, and we have some great county clerks out there. They work very diligently, and the time constraints that they're under, I think some of the dates and stuff that we could look at. But the very first chart that you had in the beginning, did you have any, it was on page 4. Did you have any suggestions for, you state that the Kansas systems are complex and involved with many steps. Any suggestions through legislation or policy or other ways to help them better perform their job and help make these, take some of the complexity out of the system? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, not about specific steps. I will repeat one thing that we heard from several county clerks, though, is that they have, to your point, they have like multiple different types of duties in addition to running elections, and that some of the due dates of different types of duties align with one another in a way that is not advantageous to them, and it makes it more difficult for them to focus on one thing at a time and really put as much into it as they could. They're also short-staffed a lot of the time, and so that makes that even worse. But beyond that, we don't have like ideas about specific steps that could be taken with regard to the things that are in Figure 1.
So Andy, on page 9 towards the top, you talk about the size of the counties and as far as having different budgets and resources. What's the impact of the county resources allocation on a county's election security?
Not sure I understand the
Is
question.
there a direct correlation there? I mean, as far as what you're finding with some of these counties that don't have the adequate resources to allocate towards election security, are there bigger issues there, or is it just a smaller county and that's how it works?
Part of what we heard from county clerks is that the state does not appropriate funding specifically for this, and so that causes funding challenges. I don't have data that proves like a direct correlation between funding level and performance against these best practices, but generally speaking, our observation is that the larger counties that intuitively you would think have more resources because they have larger counties do better overall than the smaller counties, and we think that probably has a lot to do with their resources.
Okay, thanks. And then on page 10 on the bottom, you kind of state, going back to some of the other questions, you kind of state that if they don't have the documentation, they tell you they're doing a certain procedure, but they don't have the documentation. If they weren't actually doing these things, would we have seen, or wouldn't we have seen issues with the election? Or do you think that it's a good it's a good policy to say they didn't document, they don't have documentation that they do that, so they didn't do it?
So in terms of, I think you're asking about whether we would see impacts in like, I guess the outcomes of the elections if they didn't actually do the things that they said they did but didn't document. I can't, I would be speculating to say whether I think that's true. I do know that there are redundancies in place, so it could be the case that they are not doing one of the practices have one of the controls in place that we reviewed, but there are others that would achieve similar things or would sort of like backstop that. And so it's entirely possible that they don't do one, they do the other, and then there's no problem. But in terms of speculating whether it impacted the results of the election, whether it was tabulated the right way, reflected the will of the voters, that's not something we got into.
And then finally, can you give us some idea of some best practices of other states that are similar to ours, where we have really large counties and then really small counties? I think it's a good idea to have some sort of uniform way of doing this, but we're not even close to that. So who would we look to that does a better job at it?
Other states we did not look at, so I'm not sure. I would say that in terms of having a handle on like the national landscape, Secretary of State's office, probably specifically Brian Caskey, would be able to answer that better than us.
All right, any other questions? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for the audit, and thanks to the committee for not shooting the messenger. They gave it, I thought the auditors did a really good job of giving us exactly what we asked for. And sometimes it's not everything we want to hear, but they always do a really good job. So thank you for doing that. And then there are some representatives here from the Secretaries of State office if there are any questions for them. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, either Brian or okay, Clay. Just one of the things they talked about was the inconsistencies from county to county in some of their procedures, and they were looking to your office for some guidance on that. Do you think, since there is a huge difference between those who have election commissioners and the smaller counties with the county clerks, that you would end up having to do, seems to me, probably two sets of recommendations? What works in the smaller county may or may not work in the bigger counties. Anything you can add to that?
Thank you, Senator. And if you can't hear me, let me know. I have swimmer's ear from the weekend, so my hearing isn't great. That's a great question, and honestly, I don't think I can give you a good answer, because to me, there's 105 ways of doing things, not two. So we have the 4 election commissioners, and those are obviously, all they do is elections, and they're better staffed, better resourced than the other 101. But there's a pretty big difference between Douglas County and Wallace County. And there's a big difference between Barton County and Chautauqua County. And so I think there are ways to grade that, but right now I don't know that I could adequately answer that, because every county has a different configuration, a different resource. And, we have counties that literally only have 2 full-time employees. We have counties that have 15 full-time employees that have to do the same job duties. So we're still thinking through.
It looks like the smaller counties are requesting the guidance more than the larger ones.
Absolutely. They absolutely need more assistance in lots of counties. They just don't have the expertise or the resources to do things that some of the larger counties do.
So that's something you expect to be able to do there in the Secretary of State's office before the 2024 election, to give them some more guidance or some consistent guidance?
Absolutely, yes. As far as guidance goes, absolutely yes. As far as them having the resources to implement that guidance, I'm not as hopeful, because we have zero control over that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So that goes back to the question that I was asking earlier about resources for the smaller counties. Do you feel like if that election security could be better if they had the proper resources?
I think that's an easy answer for my job at the state, because I'm not the one that has to budget for an entire county. Strictly from my view as an election administrator, I always think that we could use more resources at every level to enhance the security of our system across the board. So that's my easy answer. The hard answer is that county commissioners have lots of things that are on their plate, and so I am not going to judge the decisions of county commissioners on how they budget for their elections. They have a difficult job, and so I would say yes, at every level we need more, but those are hard decisions they have to make locally.
I guess that'd be up to the voters then.
Sorry?
I said I guess that would be up to the voters then.
Yes, absolutely.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is just a quick follow-up from the senator's question about best practices. And in our last audit review, I think it was shared that you provide just an annual or biannual, or there is an opportunity for them to come together, the clerks, and get training. But what I'm also hearing you say is that you don't have a list of best practices. There is not like a checklist of things that you should do or not, because this audit provided or looked at 50 individual best practices to review. I guess, just for clarification, do you have a list of best practices from the Secretary of State's office that can help those county clerks?
A great question, Representative. There is not a list that anyone agrees. There is a lot of information across all levels of federal government. DHS has opinions, CISA has opinions, EAC has opinions. Our office has continually and will even more so provide white papers and examples of best practices that we receive from federal agencies, but there's not a single list that everyone agrees is, if you do this, you're going to be absolutely secure. So we will continue to provide examples of best practices that we get from all of our federal partners and encourage counties to follow those. That's a never-ending job. So I will say that we will never be satisfied that we've done it all, but we'll keep pushing information as we deem that it would be effective in Kansas.
Sure, and that absolutely makes sense. I do think it would be overwhelming for county clerks, and especially small counties that may just recently have been elected to a position, to try to discern what are the best practices from so many different agencies or outlets. And so it seems to me that having a unified, at least these are Kansas best practices, we're not forcing you to use them, but this is what we deem as a list would have been potentially very helpful to especially newly elected city clerks and especially small counties that don't have the resources themselves. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of the poorest performing responses was the tabulation machine accuracy is double checked after elections. Did you guys have time to go out and issue guidelines to the county clerks after that statute was passed? Well,
The requirement's been in state law for quite a while. So what the Secretary of State's office did in 2022 is on multiple calls between our office and the county election officers, we reminded them of the law that requires them to do a post-election test and when that test takes place. And so all of them knew when it had to take place. They had a calendar. We highlighted the calendar. What happens is that during that exact time period, they're also doing post-election audits. They are reviewing provisional ballots for the county commissioners to do their county canvass, which is at the exact same time. And then if there are any recounts, all three of those things are happening simultaneously. The law does not say that you have to do a post-election test on every single machine. It is silent on that. And as a practical matter, the large counties do not have the time to do a post-election test on every piece of equipment. Johnson County has over 2,000 machines. There's not enough resources to do a post-election test on every type of machine, on every type of ballot style in that window of time.
So then you disagree with the statement in here, but the test didn't include all machines or all candidates and measures as required by law. You don't think that's an accurate
The
statement?
law is not that specific. It requires a post-election test. It does not define what is included in that post-election test. And I have not ever heard anyone say every ballot style of every machine has to be done in a post-election test. That is a phrase that I have not ever heard was required until this hearing.
Okay. Do you feel like, do you promulgate rules and regs relating to election laws for the county clerks to follow? Is that within the purview of the Secretary of State's office?
Yes, it is. And specifically within security, we have two rules and regs that have been on the books for a while that we currently, within a matter of weeks, will present before the 2024 election. One of them is on the security and storage of voting equipment, and one is on the usage, the security and usage of the voting equipment. So it's Article 7, Chapter 21, I think it's 7-21. I'm going to forget the number. There are two I can follow up with the chair, but we have two regs on the books, and both of those will be updated prior to the 2024 election.
So is there any, do you anticipate the Secretary of State's office reviewing the results of this post-audit, maybe considering additional rules and regs to increase the safety of our elections?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Going back to what you said about Johnson County, and they have, did you say 2,000 voting machines?
Yes,
So,
approximately.
and you said that they didn't have the resources or time to check them, as law says, whether you, however you interpret the law. How many, do you know how many they actually did check and how many candidates?
I do not know exactly what their post-election entailed. Again, the counties do that. The state does not prescribe specific, other than here's what the law says, and this is when the law says that has to be done.
Would our auditing team be able to get us that? How many that Johnson County actually tested after the election publicly, like law states? You do? Okay. All right. Any other question? Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A follow-up with Johnson County. I know this wasn't part of the audit, but I had heard that they weren't doing anything on ballot harvesting, that they decided that they couldn't enforce that law, didn't have the resources. Is that something that we could have legislative post-audit look into? Or would that be beyond the scope of following up on this audit?
Chris?
That's beyond the scope of what we looked at in this audit.
Any further questions? Seeing none. Andy, can you come up? Can you get us that answer, or do you have it? On how many machines Johnson County tested after the fact publicly?
So I don't know the number off the top of my head. We can follow up with them. They do a subset of them because it's based on so there's a similar pre-election test that they have to do. So they test a subset of their machines for the pre-election test because it has to occur during the period when they are setting up for the actual election. So they couldn't test all of them. And then they retest that same subset after the election.
And that's done publicly?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We can follow up with Johnson County, get the number.
That'd be great. Thanks. Any other questions? All right, we'll move on. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Look at that. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. We're going to go to K-12 at risk, and Heidi from LPA is here to present. Thank you for your work, Heidi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, committee. All right, so this is the at-risk audit. The team members for this audit were Cade Graber, Sarah Middendorf, Aaron Nice, and Matt Etzel was the manager. For reporting purposes, we consolidated questions 1 and 2 from the original audit proposal into one question. So as I present today, I'm just going to be presenting 2 questions. We're covering all the material. We're just getting it in 2 questions. So the first question was, how did school districts spend at-risk funding? And did districts and the Kansas Department of Education act in accordance with state law related to at-risk programs? So the very short answer to that question, and I will give you a much longer answer, but the short answer is that KSDE's list of approved at-risk programs continued to not comply with state law, and about 30% of the $5 million in district expenditures we reviewed also did not adhere to state law. I'm going to go through just a little bit of background before I go into the details of those findings. So first, in the 21-22 school year, the state provided about $406 million in dedicated funding to school districts so that they could deliver additional services to students at risk of academic failure. So at-risk funding is based on the number of students in the district who are eligible for a free lunch under the National School Lunch Program. Additionally, to be eligible for that funding, a student needs to be under the age of 20, and they need to be a full-time student as well. The state law requires that the State Board of Education publish a list of approved evidence-based at-risk programs. Then the districts may spend money from their at-risk funds only on the things that the board has approved. So at-risk programs that the board has approved, as well as personnel providing educational services associated with an approved program, training related to approved programs, and contracted services related to approved programs. The districts then determine which programs from the approved list that they will offer, how they will deliver those programs, and which students will participate in them. So the details of our audit findings for question 1 starts on page 5. So as I just mentioned, state statute requires the board to identify and approve evidence-based at-risk programs. However, department officials told us that the board has delegated that responsibility to the department. So as a result, it is KSDE staff that conduct the research and create the list of approved evidence-based at-risk programs. So there were 272 programs on the approved list for the 2022 school year. We evaluated 40 of them. We chose some of those programs randomly, and we chose others because we saw that school districts were using them. Our results cannot be projected because we didn't choose all of the programs randomly. So statute requires that programs included on that approved list meet 3 criteria. So first, the research behind that program should be evidence-based. Then the research should show that the program produced better outcomes over a 5-year period than would otherwise be achieved. And then last, it must be for an at-risk program or an at-risk student. So none of the 40 programs that we reviewed met all 3 criteria. So for 22 of them, a little more than half of the programs that we reviewed, we could not find any peer-reviewed research. For 17 programs, they did have peer-reviewed research, but the research did not evaluate students over a 5-year period. 1 program met the statutory evidence-based requirement, but that program was not for at-risk students. The program was a general education program. It was career and technical education. That is not a program that targets at-risk students. So only 1 of the programs we reviewed met the statutory definition of evidence-based. But that definition is quite narrow, and that's because it requires the research to show better outcomes over a 5-year time period. But most educational research does not follow students for 5 years. It usually follows students for a much shorter period of time. So we reviewed the research kind of again to determine if the programs had any peer-reviewed evidence of effectiveness, even if the research couldn't quite meet that very high bar of 5 years. But what we found was that overall, the quality of the evidence for the 40 programs we reviewed was quite poor. So again, for 22 of them, we couldn't find any peer-reviewed research. So for the 18 that we could find peer-reviewed research, for 6 of those programs, the research indicated the program was not effective or it had very weak evidence of effectiveness. For 5 of them, the program had very mixed results, but for 7, the programs did have moderate to strong evidence of effectiveness. I should note here that KSD officials told us that they plan to have a new list of approved programs ready for the districts for the 24-25 school year. We also looked at the department's list in one other way. So statute defines the purpose of at-risk programs as providing opportunities, interventions, or services that are above and beyond regular educational services. And above and beyond, that is the phrase that's in statute. So based on that statute, we expected programs on the list to provide at-risk students that above and beyond opportunity or service. However, we found that many programs on the approved list are general educational opportunities. So for example, the approved list included career and technical education, virtual schools, and dual credit courses. Additionally, several general math and reading curriculums were included on the list. Again, these are general programs that districts often use district-wide and for all students. Some of the programs on the approved list were general teaching strategies that could be used in any classroom and for all students. Some of those examples were co-teaching or project-based learning. A few of the programs were actually assessment tools that districts use to routinely assess all students. Department officials agreed with us that some of the general programs may not be appropriate, and they told us that some of them are unlikely to be approved for the next list. We also looked into why some of these problems occurred, and we found a few different things. One is that KSDE has a written process for identifying programs for the approved list, but it does not include some statutorily required criteria. So that process does not require that staff consider whether the program is for at-risk students. The process also does not require that programs have evidence that they produce better outcomes over a 5-year period. Further, KSDE staff appear to not follow their own rules for ensuring that research is peer-reviewed. Last, the board does not appear to provide any oversight to KSDE's list. A board member told us that the board has delegated this task to the department because most board members lack educational backgrounds. So KSDE officials told us that the department updates the board about that list, but we were unable to find any evidence that an update has occurred in the last few years. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about district expenditures now. So I'm on page 9. So we reviewed the accounting records for 20 school districts for their at-risk funds for the 22 school year to determine how they spent those funds. So we selected those districts to provide a good cross-section of Kansas school districts. Again, though the results here are not projectable because we did not randomly select the districts. The 20 districts spent nearly $176 million from their at-risk fund in the 22 school year. The figure on page 10 shows how much each of the 20 districts spent. And as you can see in that figure, if you look at the very bottom of it, the figure shows that overall 97% of expenditures were for salaries and benefits. The remaining 3% was mostly for professional services and supplies. Figure 2, which is on page 11, shows what types of staff the districts reported paying from their at-risk funds. And we did this work because so much of the funds were spent on staff. We wanted to provide a little more information on who those staff actually were. And so as you can see in that figure, most of the staff that were paid from the at-risk fund were instructional staff. So teachers, educators, or para-educators, and then some substitute teachers as well. So next, we reviewed expenditures to determine if they were allowable under state law. So state law requires that all expenditures from the at-risk fund be for approved programs or the educational staff, training, or contracted services related to an approved program. So we reviewed 179 expenditures from the 20 districts, again for the 22 school year. Our results are not projectable again because we did not randomly choose those expenditures. 71% of the items we reviewed were related to a program on the department's list of approved at-risk programs. So 71% of them were allowable expenditures. However, 29% of the expenditures we evaluated were not allowable. Some of the unallowable items we saw included things such as salary and benefits for food service or clerical staff, TVs, Sam's Club's memberships, food and office equipment. These items were not allowable because they were not directly related to a department-approved at-risk program or their educational staff, training, or contracted service. Further, it's unclear how much of the district's at-risk spending targets at-risk students or provides them that above and beyond opportunity that's described in statute. And it seems to be related to a couple of things. So first, the inclusion of broad and general programs on the approved at-risk program list means many expenditures are unlikely to target at-risk students. So for example, Go Math is a general math curriculum, but it is on the approved list of at-risk programs. Thus, districts can use at-risk funds to pay teacher salaries for any teacher using Go Math. This results in at-risk funds being used for general services rather than for services that provide at-risk students an additional opportunity. We also found that many districts' processes for spending at-risk funds do not directly connect spending to providing an above and beyond service. So nearly all of the districts we reviewed use their at-risk funds to pay for a portion of teacher and para salaries. So most of the districts told us they base that portion on the percentage of students in the classroom or in the building who are at risk. So for example, if 30% of the kids in the building are at risk, then they pay 30% of the teacher's salaries with at-risk funds. However, this method does not connect spending to providing any particular services to at-risk students. We also looked into some of the reasons why we saw so much unallowable spending. There were a couple of things. So first, we reviewed the 22 school year guidance document that the department provides to school districts. This is a document that answers commonly asked questions about how districts can spend their at-risk funds. So we found a couple of issues with it. The guidance document does not specify that the programs the districts can spend their at-risk funds on must be approved by KSDE. The document only says that funds must be for an evidence-based program. KSD officials told us that they mean approved programs when they say evidence-based, but based on the work we conducted during the compliance work we conducted, it is not clear to us that districts really understand that distinction. The guidance document also allows districts to spend at-risk funds for certain staff who work at schools that are 100% at risk, which is contrary to state law. Statute only allows funds to be spent on certain expenditures related to an approved program. The percentage of at-risk students in the building is not a consideration. So the last finding for question 1 on page 14. This audit showed the same problems as we found in our 2019 at-risk audit. When we audited at-risk in 2019, we found the same issues with KSDE's guidance document and their approved at-risk list. In that audit, we also raised concerns about whether districts were spending their at-risk funds on teachers and programs that served all students rather than focusing on at-risk students. Further, none of the recommendations that we made in that 2019 audit have been adequately implemented. I'm going to move on to question 2 now, which starts on page 15. So the question was, how have at-risk students performed on state assessments in the last several years? So again, the very short answer, I will give you a longer answer, but the shorter answer is students eligible for free lunches have generally performed more poorly than other students over the last several years. Just a little bit of background on state assessments real quick. Students take assessments periodically from 3rd grade through 11th grade. Students take the English language arts and math assessment every year from 3rd grade to 8th grade and then again in 10th grade. And then students take a science assessment in 5th, 8th, and 11th grade. Student scores are then placed into one of 4 performance levels for each test, and those performance levels are detailed on page 16. But level 1, which is the very bottom level, which means that the student shows limited ability for post-secondary readiness. Level 4 is that the student shows excellent ability for post-secondary readiness. So we examined state assessment scores for English language arts, math, and science. All the data that we used was provided by the Department of Education, and we compared the scores of students who were eligible for free lunch to those who were not eligible for free lunch. So the data we used did not have an indicator for which students received at-risk services, but it does indicate which students were eligible for free lunch. So free lunch is not an exact indicator for which students received at-risk services, but it is a very good proxy for which students likely received those services. So as you can see on page 17 in figure 3, that on average, the scores for students eligible for free lunch typically lagged behind other students by about a half a level. So for example, in English language arts in the 22 school year, students eligible for a free lunch scored on average of 1.7, which is just a little under 2, so a little under basic ability. While students who were not eligible scored on average a 2.3, so they're a little above that basic ability. So the gap there is about a half a level, and we consistently saw that half a level gap between those 2 groups of students. We also tracked state assessment scores for 4 cohorts of students. So basically, we looked to see how different groups of students performed over time. So when we followed groups of students over time, the proportion of all students scoring at level 1, so again, that lowest level, that proportion increased over time. And that was true, again, of all students in all subjects. But the trend was much more pronounced for students eligible for a free lunch. So if you look at the figure on page 19, it compares the percentage of students who scored in level 1 in the first year we looked at them, and then how many scored at level 1 several years later when we looked at them again. So as you can see in math, so the math is kind of the middle chart there, 38% of the students eligible for a free lunch scored at level 1 the first time we looked at them. Several years later, when we basically checked in on them again, 67% of them scored at level 1. We saw a similar trend, but is much less pronounced in students who are not eligible for a free lunch. So if you look on kind of the right-hand side of that figure, look at the orange bars, you can see that 12% of students not eligible for free lunch scored at level 1 that first time we looked at them. When we checked in on them again several years later, now 31% of them are scoring in level 1. So overall, out of this work, we found really that very few students score better over time. We also looked at graduation rates and ACT scores. So the figure on the bottom of page 20 compares graduation rates for students who are eligible for free lunch versus students who are not eligible for free lunch. And as you can see there, students eligible for free lunch graduated at lower rates than students who are not eligible, but the gap is narrowing between the two groups. Last, when we looked at ACT scores, the average ACT score for high school seniors eligible for a free lunch, again, was lower than the average for other students. The figure on page 21 compares those two groups. And as you can see, the gap between the two groups is consistently about 4 points across the years that we looked at. So just to kind of wrap up, a quick takeaway, this is the second time that we have evaluated KSDE's role in at-risk programs in the last 4 years. Despite calling out several problems and making recommendations to correct those problems in December of 2019, little appears to have changed. The problems with the department's approved at-risk program list have persisted, and districts depend on that list to drive the programs and services that they offer. When the department's list is poor, district spending is less likely to be targeted at at-risk students, and more importantly, struggling kids are less likely to get the effective help that they need. We did make some recommendations. Those are on 22. We made a recommendation to the legislature to consider eliminating the 5-year research requirement. A couple of recommendations to the department. One, to fix their guidance document so that it complies with state law. Another, to re-review their approved program list to ensure that it complies with state law. And then we also made a recommendation to the districts that they should review state statute that specifies allowable uses for spending, and then make sure that, that their policies and practices align with state law. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, Heidi, thank you very much. Any questions for Heidi? Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you think we ought to do away with the 5-year, did you see any a length of time it should be? Any preponderance that the program's complied with so that we don't move from 5 years to another length of period that's not going to work out either?
What it should be is really a policy question that I won't weigh in on, but I can tell you most of the research that we looked at really usually follows kids for a year, sometimes a little more. So a really common way of doing education research is to put kids in kind of different groups, check in on them at the beginning of the year, kind of a pre-test, and then look at them again at the end of the year to see whether there was any difference. Occasionally you do see educational research that follows kids a little longer, but it was very rare, at least in what we looked at, to see research that followed students for 5 years.
To follow up on that, wouldn't they be able to follow different students for 5 years? Like each year they have a different group of students, and if that program had worked over a 5-year period, then it would qualify? Or does the state law say they have to follow the same student for 5 years?
The state law is just a definition for what constitutes evidence-based. So for the state says evidence-based says it needs to produce better outcomes over 5 years. But most of these programs we're talking about are not programs that exist, or research is not being conducted in Kansas. This is national research, national programs. People other than people in the state are conducting that research. So we don't have any real way to tell them how they should conduct their research. It's just research that's being conducted mostly outside the state. But they're looking at all these different kinds of programs. So while they could look at students probably much longer, looking at students for that long can often be much more expensive. And so a lot of education research just does not do that.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So even if the districts were using evidence-based programs, it seems to me that the majority of the expenditures of those that you sampled, 97%, it was for regular classroom teachers. So I'm not sure that the problem is that they're using it for regular classroom teachers and they're ignoring the portion that says above and beyond. So we could talk about 5 years or 3 years or 2 years or scrapping that entirely, but would that even change the problem that they're using it for general fund purposes?
The 5-year issue is really related to the department and their ability to put together a list that would be useful to districts. Because so little research is done in 5 years, I think right now the situation we have is the department can be statutorily compliant and look for research and only put programs that have research over 5 years on the list, and that list is likely to be quite small and probably not very helpful to the districts. Or they can ignore it and put together a list that is much more useful to the school districts. And so they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. So changing that 5-year, that's really what we're talking about here, is that it would change what the department can put on the list and still be compliant with state law.
But regardless, Heidi, it looks to me that 97% of the monies that you were looking at, 171 million out of 175 million, was used for regular classroom teachers, regardless if the list was small or large. The majority of the funding was used for regular classroom teachers, correct?
Most of the funding was used for regular classroom teachers.
So again, the kids are not benefiting from, regular classroom teachers, that's the standard. That's what we need to provide. But we also need to provide it above and beyond. But I'll save some of my questions for Craig or Department of Education.
What percentage were peer reviewed at all? Or were monitored over a 1-year period? Could you tell us that?
You go back and look at our research to see for those, like I said, we looked at 40, 22 of them didn't have any peer-reviewed research, period. So of the 17 that had some peer-reviewed research, but it wasn't 5 years, I think we could go back to our work papers and probably provide you a kind of an estimate on how many of those, what the length of time for those 17 were.
All right, so given that the 5-year period might be overburdensome for them to have a large list, they ignored it completely rather than at least having some peer review, and the only 17 of the 42 you looked at?
Yes, when we looked to see, first we started with the statutory. Do these programs meet the statutory requirement? We found that all but, only one of them did. As we were doing that work, that's when we realized that most research doesn't follow students for 5 years. So we took kind of a second pass, and what we found when we kind of took that second pass is even if we don't worry about that 5-year requirement, the quality of the evidence for those 40 programs was still very poor. Half of them didn't have any research, and most of them, what research there was either no effect or it was very weak effect. And so overall, those 40, even when we don't worry about hitting that 5-year bar, the evidence behind these programs is quite poor, no matter how you look at it.
All right, thanks for that. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Heidi. A good deep dive into this. I've always been troubled by the at-risk funding approach anyhow. Are there other states, and to me it seems like we're incentivizing failure instead of incentivizing achievement, and it seems like we're requiring diversion of funds towards something that's not happening and is being ignored. Are there other states that do not use this type of funding mechanism I know that wasn't necessarily in this audit, but something we can look at that's going to produce better results, and, you know, maybe gives the districts a little more latitude to find ways to increase achievement.
We didn't look at other states in this audit, but we did look at other states in the 2019 audit. My recollection from that, which has been a few years, is that most states do provide some sort of at-risk funding, usually based on national school lunch participation, sometimes free lunch, sometimes free and reduced. But a poverty measure was the most common measure for providing, you know, at-risk funding to school districts. We did not look at that time what then happens in terms of how can the districts spend that money, whether or not they have the same kind of rules that we have. So I can't speak to that. But that previous audit, we did look at some other states.
And it seemed one last, and then, and it's just looking at the graphs, like on page 19, we're seeing even the non-free lunch cohort increasing into the level 1. So the overall trend for all is going down, even though we've put this money towards salaries and benefits. And the troubling thing to me is the graduation rate for that group, even though there's more in level 1, is the same at 94%. So one would assume that we're graduating them even though they are failing. Would that be the proper assumption?
We didn't look at it in those terms. You are correct that when you look at our kids who were not eligible for free lunch, 94% of them are graduating kind of with their cohort. When you look at page 19 and you look at what percentage of those students are probably in level 1, it is high, and it grows over time.
Yeah.
So whether or not they're being graduated while still failing, I can't speak to that, but there are some troubling indicators here.
Okay. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Their ACT scores are also dropping, which is why a lot of our colleges now don't even require it because they couldn't get in. Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I really appreciate some of the information that came out of especially question number 2. In general, at-risk equals free and reduced lunch, and free and reduced lunch generally equates to poverty. It's long been my belief and life experience that if we could really substantially do something about poverty, we could affect well beyond educational outcomes. We could affect hunger, homelessness, crimes, drugs, healthcare, violence, incarceration. I mean, the list goes on, right? It seems to me that if we could flip this from one narrow question into a broader, granted big, cumbersome, and maybe, and certainly expensive endeavor, it would probably pay for itself. If we could make a big dent in these great big issues, gosh, wouldn't that be amazing? So that was my comment. Thank you.
Have those people call our Department of Labor, because I think we have 3 jobs for each one of them that aren't working. Representative Francis.
I hate to beat a dead horse on this, but you know, we go back to this where we ask for 5 years worth of evidence-based performance on these programs. Are you saying that on these programs that we're using for the risk-based, we have some professor that goes out and runs a program for 1 year, and then it's never looked at again? Nobody does follow-ups on the efficiency of that program after it's been in effect for 4 or 5 years?
The research is peer-reviewed. So this is research that has been conducted, maybe by a professor, or maybe by a different organization, and they have submitted that research to a journal, a peer-reviewed journal, who looks at that to see, did they use, valid methodological, methodologies, and it looks at some other things. So this is peer-reviewed research, and that is what's required in state statute. So it's not quite like someone just deciding to go out and take a quick look and deciding, yes, this works. It is a more rigorous process than that when we're looking at peer-reviewed research. Quite a bit of what we saw here was not peer-reviewed. And so we did see where some of the evidence behind some of these programs was just a student dissertation, or the vendor conducted the research. So that obviously is a little bit problematic, but the statute requires that it be peer-reviewed research. And I think that does help improve the quality of the research.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. One on I'll start with the peer-reviewed piece. It strikes me that I worry that we're setting kind of an unmeetable standard. When you only have one program out of all the programs you looked at that met the statutory requirement, part of me thinks, do we have the right requirements in place in the first place? And we've already talked about how the 5 years peer-reviewed doesn't work. I would just question if there is enough peer-reviewed research out there that should be the statutory standard, or whether we're just setting up our State Board of Education and our districts for an unmeetable standard. The bigger question that I have, though, is it seems like what you're defining in this report is what you're saying is above and beyond means that it can only be utilized by or only touch a student who's an at-risk student, and that if any other student uses that service or is in that classroom or is engaged in that activity, then that doesn't meet the statutory standard. And I think you're reading things into that statute that simply aren't there. That's not anywhere in the statutory language above and beyond. And I'll give you an example. I would say on Go Math, what that is that's a tool that helps teachers develop a personalized learning differential curriculum for individual students. This is the kind of differential instruction that we're always talking about that we need more of. This is beneficial to at-risk learners because those kids have different needs than other kids in a large classroom, especially at a time when we have a teacher shortage, when we have a para shortage. So I just think that was an oversight and an incorrect piece of the audit to label a program like that as not meeting the statute, because again, I think that is immensely beneficial to a lot of these at-risk kids. Dreambox is a program that's about personalized learning for reading. Same thing, I would just apply those same comments. We talked about the amount of money that's going towards teachers and paras and things like that. If then it's a catch-22, if the standard is going to be that we can't have these kids in a regular class with their peers, we have to pull them out and have these interventions, then who do we think is providing these interventions with these kids? It's teachers and it's paras. I think we're discounting the idea of developing whole class lessons where we can keep those at-risk students with their peers for a larger percentage of their day so they can be around their peer group instead of always being pulled out and set aside. So I think that was a real shortfall of the audit. And then a question about the 29% of the expenditure items on page 12 that you evaluated that were not allowable. KSDE does a routine audit of district expenditures, and then they go back to the districts and tell them where they're incorrect and what needs to be changed. Did you wait until after KSDE had a chance to do that before doing this audit? Is that captured in that 29%?
KSDE does not do the kind of detailed deep dive into the expenditures that we do. We got their accounting records, and we looked at exactly what they spent. Usually what the department does is they ask the districts to report what they spent, and then they look at that at a very high level. We didn't take their word for it. We got their accounting records, and we looked at exactly what they spent at. It's a very fundamentally different review from what KSDE does. I would not expect that KSDE's review would capture these same kinds of things because it's just a different review. In terms of your concerns about above and beyond, There's nothing in statute that indicates that above and beyond means that it can only touch an at-risk student, and we did not view that. That's not how we viewed above and beyond. There wasn't anything in statute that would indicate that it would have to be that. And so above and beyond absolutely can happen in the regular classroom. Sometimes I'm sure that it does. So it does not mean that only a student, that it can only touch an at-risk student, and we didn't look at it that way. And we wouldn't consider that to be the way the statute requires things to be.
So what about a teacher who uses whole class lesson planning that incorporates curriculum that is meant to address the number of at-risk students in that classroom? Does that count under your way that you looked at it?
Depends on whether or not what they're using is on the approved list. Everything about spending in the state goes back to that approved list. So if there is a program on the approved list and they are using that program, we found evidence that they are using that approved program, then that expenditure would be allowable.
And then I think the biggest challenge with the performance-based piece of this audit, and I'm not necessarily faulting you because it's hard to do, is that this needs to be, if we're going to get anything meaningful out of it, it needs to be longitudinal. It needs to show how the same group of kids are doing over a period of time, and that's not what we're capturing, correct?
Page 18 does capture that for cohorts of students.
Those are cohorts. Those aren't how individual kids are performing.
It's how that same group of kids is performing on average over time. Obviously, there are tens of thousands of kids, and we can't track each one individually. We can't track each one individually. Right. Obviously, school districts can track students individually. But the cohort analysis we did where we followed the same groups of students over time is meant to address exactly that issue, that we want to follow kids, not just look at fourth graders year after year after year, but look at third graders this year and fourth graders next year and fifth graders the year after that, so that we can get a sense of how do kids do over time.
Does that include kids who are at risk one year and aren't at risk another year, or kids who have an intervention that helps their behavior and then they're no longer considered at risk? Do they stay in that cohort?
The metric here was whether or not they qualified for a free lunch, because that's the metric that we had. That's the flag that's in the data. And so we looked for students who had that flag, that they qualified for free lunch. They needed to qualify in the majority of the years to stay in the group.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will make one point on the ACT. I think it's unfair to talk about ACT scores going down when that was down by 1.8 points in the middle of a global pandemic. I think to put that on our public schools when those are the kids who are being tested during or coming right out of a global pandemic, I think that really is sort of a cheap shot towards the work that our public schools do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We looked at 2017 to 2022. So years before the pandemic, and then just the year after. So we didn't just look at 1 year, we looked at several years.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for this report, Heidi. You did a great job. In fact, I wish we could do this thorough on all the budget. I know that's impossible, but it's disturbing. The report's disturbing because of what you have found. And what bothers me is it's the second report in a row where we have groups that have neglected to enforce statute or just chose blatantly to ignore it. Either way, we've got a problem. And so I appreciate you bringing this to us. This data is so important, so critical. I look forward to your reports in the future. Thank you.
Doesn't look like there's any more questions, so just a point of clarification. You said 71% of the expenditures were allowable and almost 30% were not allowable, but that allowable relied on a faulty list from the KSDE that only one item that you looked at actually qualified. So you could really say that most of this money, and we're talking about $500 million here, most of this money was not actually focused on at-risk kids.
Our definition of allowable was something that was on the list, because that's what statute says, and that's the list that the districts were given, and we weren't going to hold them to a much higher standard. We don't expect them to go do all the research themselves. KSDE is supposed to do the research. So it's allowable if it was on the list. You're correct. We identified a number of problems with the things that were on that list, and so how does that affect our, our 30% that was unallowable? I don't know, but you're correct. There are likely some things on there that maybe shouldn't have been on that list to begin with, and we called them allowable because they were on the list, and we held them to that standard, not to a much higher standard.
It just seems like most of the laws and most of the things we do up here are focused at those children, the bottom 25% of performing kids. It'd be nice if we could all work together to make sure that those monies were spent properly. I'm baffled that they didn't even look at the 2019 audit. They also didn't reply to this audit. The board didn't reply to this audit. And now if you look through what some of the school districts replied to the audit, that they would continue to follow the list from KSDE, knowing that the list is incorrect, when their goal should be to teach these students and to bring them up to the next level, which the funding is meant to do. I wonder about it. It's not your question, I guess. It's a question for those of us on this side of the table. What can we do to get everybody on the same page to help these children? We need to think about that before this next session. And I know Christy works round the clock on things like that, and she doesn't get the credit she needs to. But when we make these laws, we need the departments to pay attention to them, and we need to put some teeth in there if they don't. That's just my opinion. And anybody else want to make a comment, you're welcome to. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you're right, teeth, and the teeth that the legislature has is the power of the purse. And so if they're not going to follow the law, there needs to be consequences when we implement this, because our goal is to educate these students. And I find it disturbing that the pattern is free and reduced lunches, especially, and some of the members may not be aware that you cannot audit free and reduced lunches. You are capped at 3% is the maximum that you can look at that program. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see actual data as to who's in those programs and where we can better serve them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, seeing nothing else, thank you very much. There are members here from the KSDE if there are any questions for them. Representative Williams.
Welcome, Craig. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Craig Nineswander with the State Department of Education.
All right, Craig, thank you for coming. I know we've talked about this before, but can you remind the committee what was the Gannon 4 and 5 reason for more state funding? What was the number one thing they identified?
I will plead the fifth, not being an attorney.
Okay, that's fair enough. It was at-risk students. At that time, from 2010 to 2019, I believe, it was that we were leaving behind 25% of our students. But now, as we look at it, that number has just ballooned forward. Ever since, even if you just look at 2015 and you look at every single year, that group of students, at-risk students, is actually growing, the number of students that aren't doing well. And I really appreciated Heidi and the team looking at the cohort group, because that's oftentimes difficult for us to get, but we will next year with some longitudinal reporting. So my next question for you is, and I wanted the entire committee to understand that that is the impetus for adding 50% more of at-risk funding, is because we wanted to help those kids that the court said we were leaving behind. But actually, we added 50% more money, and opposite happened. So something terribly went wrong. Okay, my next question for you is in 2022, we changed and we added evidence-based for at-risk funding. Can you remind the committee what the requirement was prior to that? And I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't remember, but.
I do not remember. I know our guidance had to change at that time, but it was not linked to evidence-based best practices as instruction.
Yeah, so this is something that we've talked about, and I want you all to realize this. In 2022, what happened prior to that, school districts that didn't use evidence-based practices, and we didn't define it. There wasn't a list on Kansas Department of Education. But if they didn't use those practices, then they had to show improvement in their at-risk students. Does that sound right? Yes, it does. Okay. We removed that. We said, okay, you don't have to show the improvement anymore. Just everybody use evidence-based practices and we're all good. Because my question to you, did you ever have, and I think I've asked you this before, did you ever have school districts provide the Kansas Department of Education or the State Board of Education evidence of kids improving because they weren't using best practices? Did you ever get those reports?
We get an annual report every year from every district on the practices they are using. That's turned into our title team. So yes, we receive that data every year.
Prior to 2022, they had to show improvement. That's what I'm looking for. Did you ever get school districts that were reporting that they were showing improvement?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that answer.
I think that we discussed this and nobody reported that because they didn't have to, because there was no, it said that they needed to use evidence-based practices, and if they didn't, they need to report and show and prove that the kids were improving without this evidence-based practices. But what we've seen here is that 97% of the districts that we looked at didn't use, 97% was just for salaries, for regular salaries, not above and beyond. And so therefore, what I'm seeing here is that we removed something in statute that had to show improvement, and now we're seeing a declining in student outcomes. So my question to Kansas Department of Education or State Board of Education, what do you think about the fact that for English language arts, 4 categories, 55% of our at-risk kids are performing in the 4th lowest category, and 67% are performing in the lowest category for math, up 29% in a cohort group in just 5 years. What do you think the legislature's response should be?
I can't speak for the legislature. I can tell you what our response will be. Is because it's already taking place. Maybe a little background first. When at-risk funding first came in, the requirements were very similar to federal Title I programs. So our oversight was based on the same program and provided by the same individuals. It's become obvious now that's not sufficient because the requirements have changed a bit for the state as opposed to federal Title I. So we are restructuring our resources. We will have one individual now whose sole purpose is at-risk programming and reviewing that research. Obviously, more people will be involved, but one person will be doing only that so that we can better review the research, so that we can make better recommendations for school districts and have a list that meets the definition. We agree with LPA. The definition probably needs a little change, and we'd be happy to work with the legislature on that if you think that's appropriate. But we recognize we need to restructure the advice that we're giving districts and the processes that we have in place to make that happen. And so we've done that. We started a month ago reviewing at-risk programming and funding with the state board, and we will continue that up to, as they indicated in the study, actually, I don't remember if they mentioned the exact months, but in December, January, we will have a new list for the state board to review and approve so that we can have that out for school districts, and they'll have time to make adjustments before the 24-25 school year starts.
And last comment, I do agree with Representative Francis, that, for example, on the list, as I was reviewing the list, there's summer school on there. And I think that summer school is a good use, even though it's a very generalized, large thing to do. But I mean, but I guess I'm just shocked that 97% of the money was used not on practices at all. It was just used on regular classroom, even though, yes, you can incorporate concepts and ideas in a classroom. So I do think that piece of it should be updated by the legislature. Thank you, Craig.
May I address the salary issue? Agree or disagree? Our advice to districts, and this is a point I have to take home from the audit because apparently some of them haven't heard the message, is that they may pay for teacher salaries only for the percentage of time that they are implementing evidence-based best practices off the list. So 97% of the funds being used for salaries doesn't mean it was just paying for all the teachers' time regardless of what they did. They had to be using evidence-based best practices from the list, so I just want to clarify that.
That was the recommendation, but do you know that was followed?
Well, what post-audit found that I don't know how many districts, at least 2 evidently, indicated back they were still following our old advice prior to the change in the law that they could base it on the percentage of at-risk students they had in the classroom. That has not been our advice since the law changed. So apparently we have not done a good enough job getting that information out to districts.
So you indicated you're going to come up with a new and improved list by December of this year. Is there any way to get information out to the districts, at least partially, by the beginning of next year so that they can try to focus better on these kids this year rather than wait a whole year?
Yes, we've already announced to districts that there will be changes made on the list, and those changes will be coming this winter. And the intention in doing it in December and January is so that they've got 6 months lead time before the next school year starts. To change on them now would be a little close.
They already got everything purchased and ready?
Yes, sir.
Representative Francis.
Are there even sufficient programs out there that meet the requirement of the 5-year peer-reviewed outcomes? I mean, are we just allocating so much money that it's just physically not even possible to meet the requirement?
The 5-year peer-reviewed process, is there sufficient programming to meet that requirement? We have not found that, and post-audit didn't find it in the programs they looked at.
So what should that requirement look like in the department's mind? I really don't feel like it's sufficient for a program to be ran 1 year, you know, where a small group gets a lot of focus and we see good outcomes. I mean, that just doesn't intuitively feel like me that that's sufficient. But what should that requirement be? Because I believe evidence-based programs can make a difference. But when I look at this data, I see we're allocating a bunch of money towards one group, and it doesn't seem like we're improving our outcomes at all.
I don't think I'm qualified to stand here today and tell you here's what would work in statute, but that is part of the process that we're going through now, is to review research and what's out there, so we would be able to bring a suggestion.
Can you give me a little idea of what it might look like?
No.
Okay.
And I'm not evading the question. I'm school finance more than I am research and instruction.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've heard a couple of times that the 5-year is an issue. Why did you not come to the legislature? I mean, you have a paid lobbyist, you see us in the hall all the time. Why not speak out and wait for an audit?
Partially, it goes back to what Heidi mentioned in the LPA. We had a choice of providing guidance and a list to school districts that could be implemented, or one that was so narrow that there just wasn't enough left on the list. And in hindsight, we should have come sooner. And that's, I think, part of the change in our processing internally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A follow-up on that, then, I will also ask you, on the funding, we have tried several years to mandate 65% to the classroom, not just for the high risk, but mandatory across the board. And you guys, education groups, fight us all the time. We can only get past that it's a goal to get 65% to the classroom. Shouldn't that be our number one priority, is what's going on in the classroom? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you like a response?
You go, yeah, your mic's yours.
I'd just make two comments, and again, they're debatable, I understand that. One is, it depends on how you define the classroom. If it's strictly teachers and it doesn't include counselors and other personnel, librarians that provide instructional services, then we may not be at 65%. If you include the other groups, I think we are. I haven't looked for a couple of years, so could be off there. The other is, there's no, since we're talking about research, there's no research that supports the 65% number.
Representative Williams.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify the 2019 and this 2023 audit had very similar results with or without the 5-year. So the 5-year didn't exist in the first audit. It really only existed back in 2022 when we first put it in there. And prior to that, the districts were supposed to use evidence base, wasn't defined, there was no list. They were supposed to, if they didn't use those evidence base that weren't enforced, then they just had to show improvement. That didn't happen either. So it doesn't matter which way we do it. We're not reaching these kids. The data shows the kids are getting lost in the system, and the money that the legislature put in per the Gannon case didn't work out to help the children like we wanted it to. So that's the bottom line. And I know you're sad about that as well.
Absolutely.
Well, it looks like we've got a lot to chew on for next year, and I'm no longer on the K-12 budget. I wish I was, because it was always a lively conversation, and you're always pretty darn easy to work with, and we appreciate that. So, all right, I think that's it. We're going to move on. Still slightly ahead of schedule. We're going to move on to IC. Go ahead. Are we too far ahead of schedule that we're not? That's fine. All right, moving on. Alex from LPA to present the audit on IT security. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. So this audit answered the question, do selected state agencies and school districts adequately comply with selected IT standards and best practices? The short answer is most of the ones we looked at did not. So a little bit of background to help understand the process that we did for this audit. State agencies must follow security standards to protect sensitive information, to protect it from data loss and theft. About 25 years ago, state law created the Information Technology Executive Council as a body to adopt IT policies for state agencies, including IT security policies. These standards are similar to those put out by the federal government as well as international organizations. Local entities, such as school districts, do not have to follow the state's IT security policies. They may be subject to other state laws or federal laws, but they don't have to follow ITEC standards. Nevertheless, we evaluated them against these standards because they are good best practices. At the bottom of page 7, since 2014, our office has produced IT security audits of individual state agencies, which were kept confidential. These audits generally were produced one at a time. Audits and summaries of those audits were released every 3 years. Those audits would cover between 10 and 20 subject areas and cover anywhere from 50 to 100 different control items. Last December, this committee approved a proposal that would look at fewer overall areas but touch on more entities at once. And so one of the goals was to produce a report that did that and produce it in a way that it could be released to the public. So for this audit, and I'm on page 8 and 9 here, for this audit, we reviewed controls at 15 entities, that's 12 state agencies and 3 school districts. We reviewed 3 controls areas: security awareness training, account security, and incident response. And we evaluated 5 controls in each subject area for a total of 15 controls. We followed our previously established scoring processes to evaluate compliance. For those of you new to this process, we evaluated their compliance and then scored them anywhere from 0 to 3 points based on how compliant they were with the standard. And then sum totaled their total points for an area, and then that score allowed them to fall into one of the 4 quadrants, red being the most in danger, I guess, quadrant, all the way up to green being the most secure-looking quadrant. Last thing I wanted to note for this audit, we set the cutoff for substantive compliance at 50%. So anyone scoring above 50%, we viewed as being substantively compliant. Anybody below that, we said we're not. Now, that's not to say that anybody above 50% didn't have anything to work on. There was plenty to work on, but for purposes of illustration, that's where we set our cutoff. So overall, on page 10, here's the big punchline. 9 out of 15 entities did not substantively comply with IT security standards and best practices in at least 2 out of the 3 areas we looked at. So that means they had red or orange scores in 2 out of those 3 areas. 6 of the entities had problematic scores in all 3 areas. An additional 3 entities had problematic scores in 2 out of those 3 areas. When entities don't have adequate security controls, the risk increases that confidential data is compromised, lost, or stolen. This can result in financial penalties and a large reputational damage as well. In terms of overall cause, what is behind all of this? Based on our interactions with staff, observations during the audit, and cumulative years of experience, these findings demonstrate a continued lack of top management oversight and supervision of entities' IT security functions. This is generally referred to as a tone at the top issue. Because IT security is ultimately top management's responsibility, they have a duty to put adequate safeguards in place to protect the entity's data and limit its risk of data loss. I'm going to cover a little bit more detail about each one of the areas next, starting with the security awareness training on page 11. So the big takeaway here is that 8 out of the 15 entities did not substantively comply with security awareness controls we audited. We looked at the controls listed on pages 11 and 12. Further details about the specifics of those controls can be found in Appendix C. One important thing to note about security awareness is that the state security policy has a broad definition of who is required to receive security awareness training. They require it of all users, and users are specifically defined as anyone that does work on behalf of the entity. They're required to be trained. It doesn't matter whether they have network access. It doesn't matter if they even use a computer. They are required to be trained if they do any work on behalf of the entity. And that would even include people like board members that you might not think of as a traditional employee. Figure 3 on page 12 shows that 6 of the entities had red scores or significant control issues, and an additional 2 entities had orange or major control issues. Some examples of things that we saw, we looked at whether new staff were being trained, received security awareness training within their first 90 days on the job. We found that staff were not always trained, or not always received training within that 90-day period. We also looked to see if regular staff, not new staff, were being trained every year like they were supposed to. And some entities we reviewed did not have any security awareness training. Others did have training, but they limited who had to take it. So they exempted certain groups of folks from having to take that training. Security awareness training is important because people are the weakest link in any entity's security posture, and one small action by any individual can circumvent any number of technical controls that you could put in place. All it takes is a single click, and you've circumvented your 5-figure, 6-figure firewall. There's a big problem. So the main reason for poor outcomes in this area comes down to top management not sufficiently prioritizing compliance. In many cases, where entities had training processes in place, leadership did not sufficiently monitor them to ensure that they were working as intended. Moving to the second area, account security, which starts on page 14. 10 out of the 15 entities did not substantively comply with account security controls that we audited. We looked at those controls listed on page 14, largely consisting of password configuration controls as well as account deprovisioning controls. One of the 10 entities that did not substantively comply was in the red zone. The other 9 were in that orange hot zone. Some examples of, we did see issues in each one of the controls that we looked at in this area, including things with password configurations, whether that be password lengths not being the appropriate length, whether password complexity was not turned on, things like lockouts either not being turned on or having more attempts allowed than standards allow. We also looked at whether accounts belonging to former employees were turned off within a reasonable amount of time. So when somebody leaves the agency, they don't work there anymore, it doesn't often really make sense for them to have an active user account, but that's exactly what we saw. We saw accounts that were active, accounts that took weeks or months to deactivate. Yeah, we saw all of that. So when these controls are weak or non-existent, it does become easier for unauthorized people to either access, steal sensitive information, or sabotage entity infrastructure. The main reason behind poor outcomes in this area, again, is inadequate management oversight to ensure the controls were followed. We noted limited IT staff or expertise at multiple entities, which suggests that top management is not sufficiently prioritizing IT security. Moving to the last area, incident response, which starts on page 16. 8 out of the 15 entities did not substantively comply with selected incident response controls. Those example controls, again, are listed on pages 16 and 17. They include whether they had a documented incident response plan. Do they have a game plan for how to handle a security event when it comes up? Have they defined what a security event even is and when they need to get their game plan out? Have they tested their plan to make sure that it doesn't have any holes, that kind of thing? So the details about those individual controls, again, can be found in Appendix C. The big one takeaway, aside from the examples, before I get into those, is that 5 of the entities we evaluated either created or finalized their plans during our audit. We did kind of accept those plans if they were finalized and only deducted points if those plans had significant issues. Figure 5 on page 17 shows that 6 entities were given red scores and 2 others' scores fell in the orange zone. We saw entities that didn't have incident response plans, others that had not properly defined had either no definition of security incident or had not included unintentional incidents, such as, oops, I sent that email to the wrong person, that kind of thing in their definitions. The one silver lining for this is actually in this area, all of the entities that had plans prior to our audit had either used them in the prior year or had tested them in the prior year, which is kind of the one good thing there. And So why does this matter? Incident response plans are a game plan for how to operate when that security incident happens. Having the adequate controls means it's much more likely that you're going to get the outcome you want to have. In terms of causes, we had 3 here. First, incident response is often viewed as kind of a luxury, a theoretical type of work. It's because its results are not necessarily immediately tangible, it may be kind of viewed as theoretical work versus real work of actually patching or actually pushing out updates or whatever. And so sometimes when you're overwhelmed with work, the theoretical work can get sidelined in favor of the real work. We also heard from multiple entities that IT staff sometimes just believe they can handle it. They believe they can deal with the situation when they come up, and they don't necessarily understand or appreciate the value of having that documented process. And lastly, I believe we encounter this at least at a couple entities. Top management may view incident response as purely an IT matter. This is computer related, we don't have to deal with it, it's IT. They may not understand why incident planning and documentation is important, or just kind of pass those responsibilities on over to IT. We had one other finding in this audit related to House Bill 2019, which is on page 19. Specifically, we just noted that the bill relied on an organizational structure in which audits may not be conducted objectively or independently. Specifically, we wanted to just point out that the law specifically used the term audit, and wanted to make clear that the word audit, at least to our ears, has a specific connotation, and that an audit produced under that, by KSO under that statute, may not have the same independence guarantees that an audit our office would perform. That's because KSO would be both providing the services and then determining whether the services are provided well or not. Overall, the entities agreed with our findings and conclusions. We had recommendations, start on page 20. There were 3 groups of recommendations. The first 2 were for auditees, who generally said, yes, we do those. The second 2 recommendations were for the Department of Education, which are on page 24. They said they rejected those recommendations. And then the last 2 recommendations were for the legislature on page 25. With that, I'll stand for questions.
Open for questions. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report. First of all, I like this version. Is this the first time we've done this version? I think this is very comprehensive, and I'm glad we shifted to this because it gives us a broader overview. It seems to me like some of these items are easily addressed with regard to the initial training. Some of these items are not necessarily IT. You don't have to have IT training to change passwords or use passwords. Stressing and emphasizing the need for this type of security whenever somebody new comes in, it looks to me like would be one very important way of, changing the culture in these agencies so that that very simple sort of thing is addressed right out of the gate and emphasize, hey, this is, to me, the cybersecurity is far more important than you realize. So it's A, at the top, and B, at the initial training for the new employees. Would you agree with that? I mean, with regard to IT, you don't have to have special IT training to be able to change your password every 6 months, I think we have to do it yearly on the laptop here. But, the simple and a good initial training when you're not immersed in the day-to-day activities demanded by your job seems like better training up front would help.
Security awareness training is one of those standards that the governing group ITEC has deemed to be extremely important. Obviously, I mentioned before that educating users is kind of as your front line of defense. Having them know what the threats are and how to avoid those is very important. So yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the report. So how many of these, of the 15, had previous audits?
Previous audits from us.
Yeah, and are not in compliance still.
Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think maybe 6.
Yeah, there's my concern, Mr. Chairman. We get audits, they do a great job, and we have the chairman of JCIT on the committee now. He understands this is really disappointing, and I think we need to take some major action next session.
Unfortunately, this isn't my purview. I'm probably one of those people that just click on stuff and get us in trouble, but you guys know a lot about this, and I would trust you to do the best you can. I know that some of the people on the Joint IT Committee are pretty well versed in this, so you got your work cut out for you, that's for sure. Senator Tyson.
Thank you. And which group did you say refused to even take action or do anything?
So with respect to the recommendations, the Department of Education rejected our recommendations.
That's what I thought you said. They're one of the most egregious, and their data is, it's vulnerable. It's our students. So, Mr. Chairman, that's really disheartening. Thank you.
It is concerning, especially given the news lately out of New York that their school districts were hacked, and now they're dumping very sensitive material on the internet about all these children. And it seems like we need to take a deeper dive into that and take a close look at it. I
was going to mention, we didn't audit the department itself. We did audit those 3 school districts and had some specific recommendations for the department to help provide additional support, et cetera, for school districts in terms of either adopting a standard or a set of standards that they could say, hey, districts, you need to kind of step up and follow these, or provide additional support for them.
Any further questions or comments? All right, seeing none, thank you. Let's see, we do have a couple of people here that want to make a statement. David Fry with the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. You're up first if you're here. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is David Fye. I'm the Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, and I think by manpower and also budget, we're probably the smallest agency that was audited as part of this process. But what I did want to just kind of talk about just briefly is this is a very difficult process from the legislative post-audit team. Our experience has been that they are very good to work with, and they have a really challenging task in this, and that they were reviewing findings from 15 different groups. And there's probably lots of different findings and lots of different attributes from those different agencies. For our agency, we received, in general, very positive comments in regards to most of these areas. But when I saw the draft report, my concern is that if there are 15 agencies that are having combined results being presented, and yet some of those agencies did really well in this audit, that would be kind of hidden by the overall results. So I felt it would be a disservice not to bring that forward on behalf of my agency. We do take IT security very seriously. We prepared for the audit. We even worked with members of LPA after the audit. And so I just wanted to kind of communicate that to you, that on behalf of my agency, at least, we really respect this topic. We really have benefited from the work with working with members of LPA. And when there were issues that dealt with terminology and different new findings, we always look for ways that we can improve our posture. But just wanted to kind of communicate that to you to let you know that we're doing what we can to make improvements, but we were very pleased with a lot of the positive comments we received from this audit.
All right, any questions? So you're saying if we pulled your numbers out, the averages would get even worse?
In the 3 areas, we received very positive comments in 2 of the areas and also positive comments in another. So I think you could lead to that conclusion, but I understand that there are grouped findings, so I don't want to get into too much detail on ours, but I was very pleased with what they gave us to look at and the positive feedback we got to encourage and enforce good practices too.
Well, thanks for pointing that out. All right, next up, Kristen Wheeler from Board of Tax Appeals. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I don't want to take a lot of the committee's time, but I appreciate the opportunity to address you all this afternoon and offer some brief remarks. With me, I've got Gabriel Bullard. He's the agency's IT manager, and he's been with us just since last fall. I want to thank the Legislative Post-Audit Group for their work preparing this audit, and KSO for their assistance to us in creating some policies and procedures to address areas of concern that were identified in the audit. As some of you have heard in my previous budget presentations, the agency has struggled with IT concerns for several years now, and that has been a primary focus of mine since I took over as chair 2 years ago, trying to get our systems modernized. We've struggled without in-house IT staff. We have struggled with outdated hardware and software, but thank you to the addition of some funding from the legislature last year and the receipt of some ARPA funds, we have been able to start taking steps in a comprehensive modernization initiative, which included the hiring of our IT manager, upgrading our hearing room, replacing outdated court recording systems, instituting policies and procedures designed to address IT security. We're replacing an outdated document management system, and we're working very closely with OITS to map out a migration of our system to their servers. We're grateful that the security audit from LPA gave us an opportunity to address some areas of concern that may have been overlooked in our focus on replacing outdated hardware and software. We have taken specific steps during or immediately after the audit to address the majority of those areas of concern. One of them we are still in process with because it required more massaging, I guess, is the non-technical term of software and hardware options for us to implement that, but we are taking that very seriously. And we will continue to strive to meet the objectives identified in the audit, as well as all of the ITech security requirements. With that, I would stand for any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. Any questions? Thanks for responding like you did. All right. There are other officials here from the other audited agencies. If anyone has a question for any of the agencies. Seeing none. All right, we'll close that portion of the calendar. Move on to consent calendar items. And Kristen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. On today's consent calendar, there are 3 items. Just as a reminder for you all, unless there is objection from the committee, the items on the consent calendar are considered approved. There's an exception for, and I'll talk about them when we get there, but the minutes is up first. So that's the first item on the consent calendar. Are the minutes from your last meeting, which was April 25th. Any members who weren't present may abstain from voting if that's something they would like to do. Those are shown in attachment A of tab B in your committee notebooks. So the second item on the consent calendar is acceptance of the performance audits and the IT security audit that were presented today. So that includes the election security part 2 audit, evaluating at-risk expenditures and statutory compliance, and then the IT security audit you all just heard. There is a third item on today's consent calendar, and that is approval of a limited scope audit, which you can see again if you're in tab B. It'll be attachment B in there. So the chair has preliminarily approved a limited scope audit request. Any member who has an objection to the audit approved by the chairperson shall state such objection in the form of a motion to remove the limited scope audit from the list of approved audits and to treat it as a regular performance audit, if that is anyone's interest. The limited scope audit request is evaluating the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Transparency Database and whether or not it includes the required information. So I would point out that this is requested by 4 legislators all on this committee. That's Senator Thompson, Senator Tyson, Representative Williams, and then Chairman Tarwater. So you can see the question there. Again, it's a limited scope, which means it would be a 100-hour audit. And with that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Anyone have any questions? Senator Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to make a motion, but just on this commerce audit, I just want to make a couple points. This is going to be the 9th audit of the Department of Commerce in less than 2 years. I'm not aware of any other department or agency that has been audited nearly that often by this committee. I just want to remind everybody and all the members about what an immense burden this places on all of their staff to continue to be audited over and over and over and over again. The department has made it clear that improving this database is a priority. They want to improve it. They want to comply with law. And so I am disappointed that we continue to focus, I think, on one particular department or agency over all the others. And again, this is going to be the 9th in less than a 2-year period for the Department of Commerce. They don't get any extra employees to do this. This pulls folks away from their normal jobs. So I just hope we'll keep that in mind. Disappointed that this is the course that we're taking. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Was there a question in there?
No question.
Any other questions for Kristen? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Is there anyone that'd like to abstain on the approval of the minutes if you weren't here? Senator Peterson. That's it. Is there a motion to object to any of the consent calendar items? Seeing none. All items are approved automatically. Additional business, next meeting, Nate. Chris, can you discuss that for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you'll turn to the next tab in your notebook, there's a single-page document, Legislative Post-Audit Committee upcoming meetings. I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of what is coming down the pike and when we can anticipate having our next meeting. As you can see, later this summer, the audits that will be completed and ready for this committee include working from home, a limited scope audit on the African American Affairs Commission, and one of the economic development evaluations of the Rural Opportunity Zones program in the Department of Commerce. Also, operations-wise, the executive subcommittee normally meets in late August to do a preliminary approval of the staff budget. So we're looking at a meeting. It might make sense to have a full meeting in late August and append that on with an executive subcommittee to go over the budget. Later in the fall, just going down the list, community college athletics and K-12 cost study are both looking at late September. Fiscal note audit in early November, and a 911 audit that is being contracted out, that is due November 15th. Some other operations going forward that involve this committee will need the full committee approval of our budget, considering any proposed legislation, and an evaluation of me. So I would suggest, in addition to a meeting in late August, probably the next meeting that first week of October, our budget needs to be approved by this committee before the LCC meets, and they usually meet in early to mid-October. And then even further down the line, you guys loaded us up pretty good this spring, so these audits are also on the to-do list. They've not yet been started, but just a reminder. CAPERS 3, DEI spending at the universities, motor vehicle taxes, tax increment financing districts, review of TANF, the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation, a specific aspect of what they do, and then another IT security audit like you heard today. Part 2 will be at 15 different agencies. So that's what's coming up. We'll be in touch about specific meeting dates, but likely late August, early October. Any questions?
Any questions? So in August, if we have to meet, I know that August is a big month for vacations, especially in early August, right before back to school. And so I would be targeting the week of the 21st. If anyone has any issues with days on that week, could you please get them to me before say, next week, the end of next week, so that we can get the meeting announced and everybody can plan for it. But I'm shooting for the week of the 21st. Thank you. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Adjourning early.